For 9 months, the only real description of the man who took Elizabeth Smart existed inside the head of a 9-year-old who had been pretending to be asleep. 2 o'clock in the morning, the 5th of June, 2002. A house in the Federal Heights neighborhood of Salt Lake City, Utah. In an upstairs bedroom, 2 sisters are asleep in the same bed. Elizabeth is 14. Mary Katherine is 9. Mary Katherine wakes up because there is a man in the room. He is standing over the bed. He is talking, quietly, and he has a knife. And she does the only thing a 9-year-old can do in that situation. She closes her eyes, and she keeps them closed, and she listens. She hears him tell her sister to get up. She hears him say that if she makes a sound, he will hurt her family. She hears Elizabeth's feet on the floor. She hears the 2 of them cross the room and go out through the door. And then the house is quiet again. She waits. She is not sure for how long. She would later say it felt like hours. Then she gets up and walks down the hall to her parents' room and says the sentence that starts one of the largest searches in the history of the state of Utah. There is a detail in that waiting that is hard to read about. She has just watched her sister be taken at knife point, and the thing she is weighing, alone in the dark, is whether the man is still in the house. Whether going for help gets her parents hurt. A 9-year-old ran that calculation by herself, in the dark, and then got out of bed anyway. Elizabeth is gone. The first hours of a case like this are the ones that matter most, and they went the way they always go. Police arrived. The house became a crime scene. The window screen in the kitchen had been cut, which told investigators how he got in, and told them almost nothing about who he was. They took Mary Katherine's account. A man. A knife. A voice. Words she could repeat. But no face. She had kept her eyes shut, which was the correct thing to do and also the thing that would cost the investigation the better part of a year. An alert went out. Roadblocks. Bulletins. Her photograph, a school portrait of a 14-year-old with long fair hair, went onto every front page in the country inside 48 hours, and it stayed there. That photograph is probably the most reproduced image of a missing child in modern American history. And here is the thing about a photograph that famous. It fixes a person at one moment. For 9 months, the entire country was looking for a 14-year-old girl with long fair hair, and every one of those months, the person they were looking for was changing. What she could not do that night, what would take her another 4 months to do, was tell anyone who the man was. Because she had never seen his face. She had only heard his voice. And somewhere underneath 9 years of memory, she already knew it. Federal Heights sits on the bench of the Wasatch Mountains, up above the University of Utah, looking down over Salt Lake City. Large houses, mature trees, quiet streets that curve rather than run straight. It is one of the oldest and most comfortable neighborhoods in the state. It is the kind of place where a stranger on the street is noticed, and that is worth holding on to, because the man who walked out of that house at 2 in the morning with a 14-year-old had been on that street before, in daylight, and nobody had thought twice about him. The Smarts were a large Mormon family, 6 children, active in their church, well known in the city. Ed Smart worked in real estate. The house had a security system that was not switched on that night, and a window in the kitchen with a screen that had been cut. It matters to the story that this was a family with standing and with resources, because of what they would do later. When the investigation went one way and they believed it should go another, they had the money to hire their own investigators and the standing to get a press conference at short notice. Most families of missing children have neither. By dawn on the 5th of June, the Salt Lake City police were in that house. By mid-morning it was on every television in Utah. And by the end of the week it was one of the biggest stories in America. There is a reason this case became what it became, and it is worth naming honestly. Elizabeth Smart was 14, blonde, photogenic, and from a comfortable family in a safe neighborhood. Thousands of children go missing in the United States every year and receive nothing like this attention. This one got all of it. This is not a criticism of the Smarts. Nobody chooses to be the case the cameras pick. But it is worth saying plainly, because the imbalance is the whole reason cases like Elizabeth Smart's, and thousands of quieter ones, never get a fraction of this. Which cuts both ways. The coverage brought volunteers by the thousand. It also brought noise, theories, psychics, and a pressure on investigators to produce a suspect that would end up costing this case 9 months. And it distorted the shape of the investigation in a way that is hard to see from inside it. When a case is that public, the cost of being wrong in public goes up enormously, which makes an investigation less willing to change direction, not more. The very attention that was supposed to help made it harder to turn the wheel. What followed was, at the time, the largest search operation Utah had ever mounted. Volunteers came in the thousands. They walked shoulder to shoulder through the canyons above the city. They searched storm drains, hillsides, abandoned buildings, the dry creek beds that run down out of the mountains. Helicopters worked the ridgelines. Dogs worked the gullies. The geography did not help. Salt Lake City sits against the Wasatch Front, and the mountains start almost immediately behind the houses. Within 20 minutes of leaving a suburban street you can be in steep, wooded canyon country with no roads and no sightlines. It is beautiful, and for a search team it is close to a worst case. Add the noise. A case this size attracts every kind of contribution, sincere volunteers, journalists, and a steady stream of psychics and tipsters generating leads that all have to be logged and cleared by people who have a finite number of hours. There is a particular cruelty in that phase of a case, and families who have been through it all describe the same thing. The phone rings constantly and almost none of it is real. Every sighting has to be run down. Every one that fails takes something out of you, and there is no way to stop taking the calls, because the next one might be the one. Here is what almost nobody knew at the time, and what makes the whole thing painful in hindsight. For part of that summer, Elizabeth Smart was being held in a camp in the mountains roughly 3 miles from her own house. Search teams passed within a few hundred yards of it. The camp was up a canyon behind the neighborhood, a hollow in the trees on a steep hillside, screened from any trail. Not a building. Not a bunker. Just ground, and cover, and the fact that nobody walked directly over it. The conditions there were what you would expect from ground rather than shelter: exposure, cold at night, no sanitation, and through the summer, heat. She was tethered for a long stretch of it. I am not going to go further than that, and there is a reason. Elizabeth Smart has been extremely clear, in public, over many years, that the detailed cataloging of what was done to her is not the story and is not something she wants recirculated. She has told it once, in her own words, in her own book, on her own terms. That is the version that should stand. 3 miles. You could walk it in an hour. And for weeks, the largest search in the state's history moved across the ground and did not find her. And then later that year they moved, which is the part that undoes most people's assumptions about this case entirely. The 3 of them traveled to California, and then came back to Utah. Not hidden the whole time. Moving. Through towns. Past people. They went to San Diego for part of the winter. They came back in the spring. And in all that time the 3 of them were in public places, walking, riding buses, at one point in a restaurant, with a girl whose face was on posters in every state they passed through. Think about what that travel means for the search. Every poster, every roadblock, every canyon walked by volunteers was built on an assumption that she was near Salt Lake City. For a stretch of that winter she was 600 miles away, in a different state, on a different set of streets. Which raises the question that every audience asks about this case, and it deserves a straight answer rather than a squeamish one. Why did she not run? Why did she not say something to somebody, in a shop, on a bus, at a table? The answer, and she has given it herself many times in public, is threats against her family. She was told what would happen to them. She was 14. She had every reason to believe it. Staying alive and keeping the people she loved alive meant doing exactly what she was told, and that is not weakness, it is a 14-year-old correctly reading a situation she had no power in. There is a version of this question that is really an accusation, and it gets asked of nearly every survivor of nearly every case like this. It is worth retiring. Nobody who asks it has been in the position, and the people who have been in it are unanimous about what it was like. Then, in the autumn, the search moved indoors. Because investigators believed they had their man. This part of the story is one that gets skipped, and it should not be. There was a handyman named Richard Ricci. He had done work at the Smart House. He had a long criminal record. And in the weeks after the abduction he was arrested on unrelated charges and became the center of the investigation. Before we get to him, it is worth knowing who Brian David Mitchell actually was, because he was not a stranger to Salt Lake City. He had grown up in the area. He had been a member of the church and had drifted away from it. By 2002 he was living on the street under a religious name he had given himself, in robes, preaching to anybody who would listen. People knew him by sight. He was a recognizable figure downtown, which is precisely why his own family recognized the sketch, and precisely why 2 drivers in Sandy recognized him. He was hiding in a city where hundreds of people had walked past him. And that is the uncomfortable symmetry of this case. He was invisible for 9 months because he was already a familiar sight, a bearded man in robes in a city where a bearded man in robes was simply part of the scenery. Being conspicuous, in the right way, is its own kind of camouflage. He fitted, on paper, almost too well. He had worked in the house, so he knew the layout. He had a record. He had no clean account of his movements. If you were building a suspect out of the available parts, you would build him. He was never formally charged with taking Elizabeth Smart. He denied it. But the family were told, in effect, that police were as close to certain as they get. One of Elizabeth's uncles later described the position he was given as 99.9%. The pressure on the investigators here should not be underestimated. The whole country was watching. Every day without a suspect was a day of coverage asking what the police were doing. And a suspect who fits relieves that pressure enormously, which is exactly why it is so dangerous. On the 30th of August, 2002, Richard Ricci collapsed in his cell at the Utah State Prison. He had suffered a brain hemorrhage. He was taken into surgery. He died that night. He was 48 years old. And with him went the theory the entire investigation had been built on. There was no confession. No body. No location. Nothing. A man was dead, his family were left with a public accusation that had never been tested in a courtroom, and Elizabeth Smart was still missing. It is worth being fair to Richard Ricci in a way that the coverage at the time was not. He was never charged with this crime. He denied it until he died. And he was, we now know with certainty, not the man who took Elizabeth Smart. A version of this story that leaves him out is a tidier story, and a dishonest one. His widow spent years afterwards trying to get that on the record. And the wider point stands beyond this one man. An investigation that has publicly settled on somebody has already done damage that a later correction does not fully undo. The retraction never travels as far as the accusation did. Investigations do this. They narrow. They have to. You cannot chase everything with the same energy, and a suspect who fits gives a case a spine. But a narrowed investigation is also a blind one, and by that autumn the file on Elizabeth Smart had gone quiet in the way these files do. Which is when a 9-year-old sat up in bed. To explain what happened in that room, we have to go back to the previous November, 7 months before the abduction, and to a job that took one afternoon. Elizabeth's mother, Lois Smart, was in downtown Salt Lake City doing Christmas shopping when she passed a man panhandling outside a shop. He was in his 40s, bearded, and he told her that he was looking for work rather than money. She hired him on the spot to do odd jobs at the house. He came, he worked on the roof for a few hours, he was paid, and he left. He was at the Smart house for roughly 5 hours, once, and then he was gone. Nobody wrote his name down. He had given one, Emmanuel. It is worth pausing on how ordinary that transaction is. Hiring a stranger for an afternoon's work is something that happens in every neighborhood in America every week of the year. Nothing about it is a warning sign. Nothing about it would be remembered by anybody, and it was not. Think about how small that is. One afternoon, 7 months before anything happened. He was not a friend of the family. He was not a neighbor. He was not in any photograph, on any list, in any file. He was a man who had been on the property for a single afternoon and had been forgotten by every adult who met him. But he had talked while he worked. And a 9-year-old had been in the house that day. In the first week of October, 2002, 4 months after the abduction, Mary Katherine Smart was at home when the thing came loose. Memory does not work the way television says it works. It is not a tape you rewind. It is a set of associations that can sit inert for months and then fire without warning, triggered by something small and unrelated, a smell, a phrase, the shape of a sentence. And children's memory is not simply worse than adults, it is different. Children encode less context and fewer names, but they are not worse at voices, and they hold on to sensory detail with unusual tenacity. The thing that had stayed with Mary Katherine was not a name or a face, because she had never had either. It was a sound. What she said to her parents was, in substance, this. She thought she knew who it was. She thought it was Emmanuel, the man who had worked on the roof. She had not seen his face that night. But she had heard him speak, and the voice was the same voice. Sit with what that actually is for a moment. A 9-year-old had been carrying a piece of evidence for 4 months without knowing she had it. Not a face. Not a name that anyone had written down. A voice she had heard for a few hours, in passing, the previous autumn, matched to a voice she had heard in the dark while keeping her eyes shut. There is also the question of why it took 4 months, and the honest answer is that nobody knows. Trauma does strange things to retrieval. So does being 9. What is documented is the sequence, the abduction in June, months of nothing, and then a name spoken out loud in October. What is also documented is what she did not do, which is embellish. Her account stayed consistent. She did not add a face she had never seen. She did not produce details that would have made the lead easier to act on. She reported exactly what she had, which was a voice and a name, and nothing else. It is the single most fragile piece of evidence you could design. And it was correct. And for a long time, almost nobody wanted to hear it. Put yourself on the other side of that desk. You are running the highest profile missing child case in America. Your investigation has spent months on a suspect who has now died. And the family come to you with a lead that consists of a 9-year-old, 4 months after the fact, recognizing a voice belonging to a man whose surname nobody knows. It is not that anybody thought she was lying. It is that a child's recovered memory of a voice, arriving that late, is exactly the kind of lead that investigators are trained to be careful with, because it is exactly the kind of lead that has sent cases badly wrong before. Recovered memory has a bad history in American criminal justice, and investigators know it. Whole categories of cases in the 1980s and 90s collapsed on exactly this kind of evidence, and people went to prison on memories that turned out to have been constructed rather than recalled. Caution here is not stupidity. It is a scar. So the disagreement here was not stupid on either side. The police had a defensible reason to be cautious. The family had a defensible reason to push. What resolved it was not one side persuading the other, it was the family going around the process entirely and putting the description in front of the public. So the smart family did something that in most cases would be a terrible idea, and in this one turned out to be the only thing that worked. They went around the investigation. They hired their own people. They pushed the description into the press themselves. Ed Smart went public with the name Emmanuel and with what his youngest daughter had remembered, over the reservations of the people running the case. Ed Smart in particular became a fixture on television, and he was criticized for it at the time. A father pushing a theory the police did not hold, in public, on a case this size, is not a comfortable thing for anybody involved. He did it anyway, week after week. It is easy now, knowing how it ended, to say he was obviously right. He was not obviously right at the time. He was a grieving father contradicting the police on national television about a lead that came from a 9-year-old's 4-month-old memory. If it had gone the other way, that is how it would be remembered. There is a version of this story where the family defer to the professionals, and the lead goes into a file, and nothing happens. That version is much more common than this one. What they needed was a face. And the only place a face existed was in the memory of a child. So a forensic artist sat down with Mary Katherine Smart and did the slow, strange work of building a portrait out of a 9-year-old's recollection of a man she had seen for a few hours, more than a year earlier, when she was 8. The technique matters. A forensic artist working with a child does not ask them to describe a face. Children are bad at that, and leading questions contaminate what little is there. The work is slow, indirect, and mostly a matter of putting options in front of them and watching what they reject. And the result was never going to be photographic. It is not a likeness in the way a photograph is a likeness, it is an approximation of a face, filtered through a child's memory and an artist's hand. It did not need to be exact. It needed to be close enough that somebody who knew him would stop. The sketch that came out of that session is one of the most consequential drawings in the history of American missing persons cases. A bearded man in middle age. Not a photograph. Not a description from an adult witness. A picture assembled from a child's memory of a voice's owner. In February of 2003, that sketch went out publicly, and it went on to the television program America's Most Wanted, in front of an audience of millions. It is easy to forget how much television could still do in 2003. There was no social media. A face going out on a national broadcast reached an audience that no other mechanism could, all at once, in a single evening, and America's Most Wanted had spent 15 years training its viewers to actually look. And then two things happened that no plan could have arranged. First, members of the man's own family saw the drawing and recognized him. They gave police a name. Emmanuel was Brian David Mitchell, a former street preacher who had drifted through Salt Lake City for years. Second, and more important, ordinary people watching a television program in Utah looked at a bearded face on their screen, and it stayed with them. It is worth pausing on how thin that thread is. The program aired. Some number of people in Utah happened to be watching that night rather than doing something else. Some smaller number retained a bearded face well enough to recognize it weeks later on a pavement. Everything after this point runs through that. The 12th of March, 2003. Sandy, Utah, a suburb south of Salt Lake City. An ordinary weekday. 3 people are walking along State Street. A bearded man. A woman. And between them a girl in a gray wig and sunglasses, dressed in robes. They had been walking around in public like that for months. That is the detail that people find hardest to accept, and it is the detail that matters most. She was not underground. She was outdoors, in Utah, in the open, while her face was on the front page of every newspaper in the state. Two separate sets of people saw them that morning and thought the same thing. They had seen that man on television. One of them said so out loud, that he recognized him from America's Most Wanted. They called the police. Two separate calls, from people who did not know each other, about the same three figures on the same stretch of road. That is what a broadcast does. It does not produce one witness. It produces the chance that several unconnected people are all carrying the same picture on the same morning. The officers who responded did not know what they were walking into. From a patrol car it was three people on a pavement. What decided it was not force or a chase, it was somebody standing there long enough to keep asking a girl in a wig and sunglasses who she was, and not accepting the first three answers. Officers stopped the three of them on the pavement. The girl said she was not who they thought she was. She kept saying it. It took time, and it is worth understanding why she said it, and I am not going to pretend I can explain 9 months in a sentence. 9 months is long enough to be told a great many things about what will happen to your family if you say your name. It is long enough for a 14-year-old to work out that compliance is what keeps everybody alive. Whatever was happening in that girl's head on that pavement, it was not confusion about who she was. Then she said her name. Elizabeth Smart had been missing for 9 months and 7 days. She was found alive, 5 miles from her own front door, by 2 members of the public who recognized a face from a drawing made by her 9-year-old sister. She was 15 years old. She had turned 15 while she was gone. What happens next is the part almost nobody plans for. She had been gone 9 months. She came home to a house full of relatives and a street full of satellite trucks, into a country that had spent 9 months talking about her, and she had to work out how to be a 15-year-old in the middle of it. Her family made one decision very early that shaped everything after. They refused to let the story be told as a ruin. Ed Smart said publicly that his daughter was alive, that she was home, and that this was a happy ending, and he said it in a media environment that was straining to make it into something else. That framing was not universally popular. There were commentators who wanted a darker story and a more broken girl, because that is a more familiar shape. The family declined to supply it, and Elizabeth herself has declined to supply it for more than 20 years since. Her father was brought to the police station in Sandy. 9 months and 7 days after he had been woken at 2 in the morning by his youngest daughter, he walked into a room and his other daughter was in it. There is no useful description of that. There is footage of the aftermath, the Smart family outside their house, the street full of neighbors and cameras, and it is the only genuinely uncomplicated moment in this entire story. Mary Katherine was 10 by then. She had spent 9 months as the only witness to the worst night of her family's life, carrying a piece of information she could not access, and then 4 more months being politely doubted about it by adults with badges. She was 10. What happened afterwards took the better part of a decade, and most of it turned on a single question, whether Brian David Mitchell was competent to stand trial at all. He disrupted proceedings. He sang in court. State courts found him incompetent, and the case stalled for years, which is its own kind of ordeal for a family who had already waited long enough. The competency question is not a technicality, and it is not the same as an insanity defense. Competency asks whether a defendant can understand the proceedings and assist his own lawyers. A man can be profoundly deluded and still be competent. Untangling those two things took years, and Elizabeth Smart aged from a teenager into an adult while it happened. 7.5 years passed between the rescue and the federal verdict. Think about what that means practically. She finished high school inside that gap. She went on a mission for her church. She started university. And at intervals, she had to put all of it down and go back into a courtroom. It is worth saying that the delay was not anybody behaving badly. Competency proceedings exist to stop the state from trying people who cannot participate in their own defense, and that protection is worth having even when it is agonizing to watch. But the cost of it lands almost entirely on one family. The matter eventually moved to federal court. In December 2010, a federal jury in Salt Lake City rejected the insanity defense and found him guilty of kidnapping and unlawful transportation of a minor. On the 25th of May, 2011, Brian David Mitchell was sentenced to life in federal prison without the possibility of release. Wanda Barzee, who had been with him, pleaded guilty and served her sentence. She was released in 2018, which caused considerable public argument at the time. Her release in 2018 came earlier than most people expected, on a recalculation of time served, and it produced a wave of public anger and a set of legal arguments about supervision that ran for months. Elizabeth Smart spoke about it publicly, and what she said was measured in a way that a lot of people found remarkable. The argument was not really about Barzee. It was about the fact that release calculations are arithmetic, and arithmetic does not know anything about what happened. Systems have to work that way to be fair at scale. It just means the arithmetic occasionally produces an outcome that everybody involved finds intolerable. And through all of it, the years of hearings, the competency fights, the singing in the courtroom, Elizabeth Smart kept turning up and sitting in the room. She testified. She sat a few meters from him and gave her account in open court, and by every account of that day she was steady while doing it. It is a strange thing to say about a court appearance, but it is the moment the balance of the whole story shifts, the person who had been described by everybody else for 8 years describing it herself. Here is where this case stops being a kidnapping story and becomes something else. Because there is a particular thing that happens to people this happens to, and it is almost always the same thing. They disappear a second time. They stop giving their name. They move somewhere nobody knows them, and who could blame them? Elizabeth Smart did the opposite, and she did it early. Within a few years she was standing in front of rooms full of strangers, using her own name, telling her own version of what had happened to her, in her own words. She testified before Congress. She campaigned for changes to how missing children are handled and how the Amber Alert system works. She founded an organization in her own name. She has spent more of her life now as an advocate than she spent as a missing person by an enormous margin. She also did something less visible and probably more useful. She has spent years arguing about how survivors are talked about, that the language of ruin and damaged goods, which she was surrounded by as a teenager, is itself part of the harm, and that a child who has survived something should not then be told their life is over. The case also arrived at a moment when American law on missing children was in motion, and it pushed. The Amber Alert system existed but was a patchwork of local schemes. In the spring of 2003 federal legislation put it on a national footing. It is not accurate to say this one case caused that. It is accurate to say it was in the room. The other change was quieter and harder to legislate, how police treat a family's own information. Not every family will be right. But a system that treats the household as a source of noise rather than a source of evidence will keep missing the thing that was in the house the whole time. There is one more practical lesson buried in this case that gets almost no attention. The single most useful piece of physical evidence anybody produced was a drawing, a technique that costs nothing, requires no laboratory, and depends entirely on somebody sitting patiently with a witness that other people had written off. And she has been consistent about one thing in particular, which is worth repeating because it is the actual point of telling this story. She has said, over and over, that what happened to her is not who she is. That she is not a symbol, or a warning, or a lesson. She is a person who had 9 months taken and then took the rest back. So what do we take out of this one? The search did not find her. The largest volunteer operation in the state's history walked within a few hundred yards of where she was being held and went past it. The investigation did not find her either. It spent its best months on a man who died without being charged. What found her was a 9-year-old's memory of a voice, a drawing made from that memory, a television program, and 2 ordinary people on a Wednesday morning who looked twice at a man on a pavement and picked up a telephone. Look at the timeline that chain implies. She was taken on the 5th of June. Mary Katherine surfaced the name in early October, 4 months in. The sketch went public in February, 8 months in. She was found on the 12th of March. From the moment a 9-year-old said a name out loud to the moment her sister came home was about 5 months, and almost all of that was spent persuading people to act on it. That is a chain with about 5 links in it, and every single one of them could have failed. Mary Katherine could have never made the connection. The family could have deferred to the investigation. The sketch could have gone nowhere. Nobody could have been watching that night. Nobody could have looked twice. And notice what is not in that chain. No forensic breakthrough. No database match. No confession. No informant. The evidence that ended this case was a memory, a drawing, and 2 strangers paying attention on their way to work. If you have watched the other films on this channel, you will have noticed the pattern by now. Elizabeth Smart was found because a computer rejected 9 digits on a college form. Elizabeth Smart was found because a 9-year-old remembered a voice and 2 drivers looked twice. The searches did not find either of them. It is uncomfortable how much of this depended on luck, and how little of it depended on the search. But that is what the record says, and the record is what we have. Which is not an argument that searches are pointless. It is an argument about where the leverage actually is. Thousands of people walking a hillside is an enormous amount of effort producing, in this case, nothing. One drawing on one television program produced everything. And there is a version of this case that ends differently at half a dozen points. If Mary Katherine had opened her eyes that night, she would have had a face, and she might not have survived to give it. If she had never made the connection in October, the file goes cold. If the family had waited for permission, the sketch never airs. And if there is one thing to carry out of it, it is probably this. The most important witness in one of the biggest missing persons cases in American history was 9 years old, and she was doubted, and she was right. And the second thing, which is harder. Everybody in this story behaved reasonably. The police were reasonable to be cautious about a 4-month-old memory from a child. The family were reasonable to push. Richard Ricci was reasonable to deny it. Reasonable people, acting reasonably, still spent 9 months not finding a girl who was 3 miles up the hill. If a case like this stays with you, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children keeps files open for as long as it takes. Elizabeth Smart stayed open for 9 months and 7 days. Thank you for watching.